The Nexus bloom was, to put it mildly, a riot of life. Not the chaotic, screaming kind of riot you'd find in a crowded market, but a lush, verdant explosion of alien flora, all contained within the massive, multi-tiered structure orbiting the exoplanet. Bioluminescent fungi cast an ethereal glow on cascading vines, and strange, gravity-defying trees stretched their branches towards the transparent dome, showing off a sky unlike any Elias had seen on Earth. He still sometimes had to pinch himself to believe that he, Elias Thorne, a self-taught botanist from a small town in Iowa, was actually here, a part of this amazing experiment in interspecies cohabitation. He adjusted his worn-out spectacles, peering through the foliage at a cluster of shimmering, iridescent blossoms that were supposed to be part of the new hybrid ecosystem he was working on. "Okay, you little glow bugs," he muttered, more to himself than the plants, "are we playing nice today?" He pulled out his datapad, its screen flickering to life with a complex diagram of plant DNA sequences and nutrient charts. Elias, with his messy brown hair and a slight frame that seemed more at home amongst the lab benches than in a bustling space station, was a study in controlled chaos. He was a meticulous researcher, completely engrossed in his work, but a bit of a mess outside of his laboratory. His faded t-shirt, bearing the slogan "I love photosynthesis," was a testament to his priorities, and the slightly smudged lens of his glasses told of late nights poring over botanical journals. A soft, melodious chime echoed through the botanical garden, a gentle reminder of the station's public address system. "Attention all personnel, Sector Gamma 7 is now open for interspecies observation," a pleasant, synthesized voice announced. "Please remember to maintain a respectful distance and refrain from touching the flora. Or fauna. Or anything, really. Just look. That's what we are paying you for. This is a reminder, no touching." Elias chuckled, imagining the exasperated sigh that must have accompanied that announcement. He was more than familiar with the station's struggles to maintain order in this controlled Eden. He had once seen a glabion, a large, six-legged insectoid species, attempt to test a rare, carnivorous flower, and the subsequent chaos had been enough to convince him to always be on his best behavior around alien flora, and alien fauna as well. He was about to go deeper into the observation of the hybrid ecosystem when a shimmer of movement caught his eye. It wasn't plant-based, or at least it didn't look like it. In a small alcove nestled amidst towering ferns, stood a figure unlike anything he had ever seen, even on the Nexus bloom. It was tall and slender, with an almost ethereal grace. Its body was a translucent, crystalline exoskeleton, a network of glowing geometric structures that shifted with an internal light, like a living kaleidoscope. Delicate tendrils of crystalline material extended from its form, resembling vines or the finest of lace, all glowing with various soft, internal lights. It was a KRYLL. He knew of them, of course. The station had dedicated the sector as their living space. Highly intelligent, cybernetic beings with a deep symbiotic connection to a network of crystalline flora that they considered a shared consciousness. But seeing one up close, in all its intricate detail, was a completely different experience. Elias, always drawn to the unusual and the beautiful, felt his breath catch in his throat. He carefully approached, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Hello," he said, his voice a little higher than he intended. I didn't mean to intrude. I'm Elias." He held up his datapad as if it was a peace offering. "I'm a botanist, here at the station. Working on ecosystems." The KRYLL slowly turned its head towards him. There were no distinct facial features, no eyes or mouth that Elias could see. Instead, there was a smooth, almost featureless surface where the face would be, with intricate light patterns shifting and swirling underneath the crystalline layer. It was like looking into a living nebula. The light patterns seemed to focus on him as if assessing his presence. After a moment that felt like a lifetime, a series of soft, clicking sounds came from the figure, accompanied by a subtle shift in the glowing patterns of its body. It wasn't human language, of course. It was the KRYLL's unique method of communication. Telepathic signals, light modulation, and some other strange, not fully understood sensory output. "Greetings, Elias," a gentle, almost musical voice echoed directly inside his head. I am designated as Unit 734. But you may call me 7. Elias blinked, startled. He'd read about the telepathic component, but experiencing it was something else entirely. It's an honor, 7, he stammered. I've been wanting to study your kind. The KRYLL, I mean. Not you personally, in that way, of course. Your interaction with crystalline flora is fascinating. He winced, realizing how awkward he sounded. 7 tilted its head, or what Elias presumed was a head, considering the lack of definable features. The crystalline vines around her body shifted slightly. Fascinating, she echoed, the word resonating within his mind. Your assessment is accurate. We observe you are curious. It would be logical to examine. Examine? Oh, well, yes. I mean, I'm doing research on plant life and the interactions with you, I suppose. Your crystalline form? Elias struggled to articulate his scientific interest without sounding like a complete buffoon. He pointed his datapad towards her. I'm cataloging data on that thing on your farm. He was trying very hard to be respectful, but his scientific mind was in overdrive. 7 turned her arm slightly, exposing the intricate network of crystalline structures that ran beneath her exoskeleton. Elias stepped closer, his eyes wide with wonder as he saw the complex, microscopic veins and the almost imperceptible pulses of energy flowing through it. He was completely lost in the beauty of it all, the nerd in him taking full command. It is a bioneural interface, 7 explained. Part of our connection to the crystalline network. We also use it for sensory inputs and for communication. It's how I'm talking to you. Amazing, Elias whispered, almost breathless. He reached out a hand, then quickly pulled it back as if burned. Oh. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't touch, I know. But it's just so, he gestured helplessly with his datapad. Just then, a faint tremor went through the station. It was slight, almost unnoticeable, but Elias, hyper-aware of subtle changes in his environment, felt it. He glanced around, thinking it was a structural issue. But then he noticed that 7's light patterns flickered, not in the graceful, fluid manner he had observed before, but in a jerky, erratic way. It was as if a circuit was glitching. Her internal lights pulsed irregularly, creating strange, chaotic patterns. 7? Are you all right? Elias asked, concern creeping into his voice. He reached out towards her again, this time intending to check her health, without touching her crystalline body. Before she could answer, or even react, 7's internal luminescence flickered one last time, then a strange sound, a high-pitched whine, filled the air, and suddenly small, harmless electrical discharges shot out from her crystalline arm towards the space surrounding it. The energy crackled and popped like tiny fireworks, and the unexpected burst sent Elias stumbling backwards, his datapad clattering to the floor, his hair standing on end and a sheepish grin plastered to his face. He sat on the floor, blinking, and trying to process the unexpected mini-electric shock. He laughed nervously, glancing back at 7. Well, he said, picking up the datapad. That was unexpected. Guess there's a bit more to you than meets the eye. A bioelectric, crystalline, sentient flower that discharges electricity. Fascinating. He smiled, looking at 7 with a strange, giddy feeling. Are you okay though? 7 stood still, her light patterns now erratic and chaotic, while a low whirring sound came from her internal mechanisms. The light patterns intensified, pulsing with a sense of unease, even as she tilted her head in that curious, analytical manner. System E malfunction, she stated, the word echoing strangely in his head. Diagnosis required. Close proximity analysis beneficial. She moved closer to Elias, her crystalline tendrils gently reaching towards him. Elias, still slightly dazed from the minishock and the sudden emotional impact of Seven's proximity, felt his heart beat a little faster, a strange mixture of fear and excitement bubbling in his stomach. He swallowed, trying to regain his composure. Right. System malfunction. Close proximity analysis. Of course. He knew this was the beginning of something unusual, to say the least. He just didn't know how unusual yet. The aftermath of the impromptu light show left Elias feeling more intrigued than alarmed. His datapad, thankfully, had survived the fall with only a few minor scratches, and after assuring himself that no significant damage had been done to the surrounding foliage, his scientific curiosity was officially piqued. He decided, for the sake of research, of course, to investigate the strange energy fluctuations coming from Seven. He rationalized that if he could understand what was causing the erratic bursts, he might be able to help her, and, by extension, further his own understanding of KRYLL biology. It was a win-win, really. He spent the next few days in the botanical gardens, making sure his research duties were fulfilled but also spending an inordinate amount of time near Seven. He'd meticulously log her light patterns, noting the timing and intensity of the flickers, and try to correlate them with environmental conditions and other factors. He'd also ask her questions, which were mostly answered with her usual calm, analytical tone, but sometimes with a strangely innocent curiosity that was, quite frankly, adorable, despite her lack of a traditional face. 7. Elias asked one afternoon, as he was adjusting the settings on a portable spectrometer, does this flickering feel uncomfortable? I mean, is it like a headache or more like I don't know, an electrical tingle? He winced internally, knowing how poorly he was phrasing things. 7 paused, her internal light shifting in a mesmerizing dance. Uncomfortable is not the correct descriptor, she replied, her voice resonating inside his skull. It is a disruption. An irregularity in my energy flow. It is inefficient. Inefficient, right. Gotcha. Not painful, just inefficient, Elias muttered, scribbling notes on his datapad. He had to remember that KRYLL didn't experience emotions the same way humans did. They were a species of logic and efficiency, where feelings were more like data streams to be processed rather than raw experiences. He found himself increasingly drawn to her. It wasn't just the scientific intrigue, though that was definitely a factor. It was also the way she would sometimes tilt her head when he talked, or the subtle shifts in her crystalline patterns that seemed to indicate, well, something. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. He rationalized it as simply being a manifestation of his human tendency to project feelings onto inanimate objects, even if 7 was anything but inanimate. One day, while Elias was trying to explain the concept of color to her, showcasing various samples of brightly colored plants, 7's crystalline tendrils moved towards him, gently brushing against his arm. He felt a strange tingle run through his skin, not unpleasant, but surprising. The touch was as light as a feather, but it felt like a jolt of electricity had gone straight to his heart. Your energy signature is intriguing, 7 stated, her voice echoing softly in his mind. Your proximity is causing fluctuations in my bioluminescence. Elias blushed, his cheeks heating up despite the cool, humid air of the botanical garden. Oh, he said, trying to sound casual, is that a bad thing? Should I back off a little? He almost hoped she would say no. No, 7 responded instantly. The fluctuations are not negative. They are significant. A logical course of action would be to explore this further. Elias blinked, trying to decipher the KRYLL's logic. Explore further? Like scientifically explore, right? I mean, of course, that's why I'm here. For science. He adjusted his glasses nervously, his hands suddenly feeling clammy. The crystalline vines on her body shifted and pulsed, emitting a faint, floral scent that Elias hadn't noticed before. Affirmative, 7 responded. My crystalline network indicates a high probability of compatible energy signatures. A shared energy exchange is indicated. She moved closer, her tendrils brushing against him again. Human rituals indicate this would be defined as bonding. Elias's mind went completely blank. Bonding, he squeaked, his voice cracking slightly. As in, friendship bonding? Or for something else? He had read about KRYLL reproductive practices and understood that their idea of bonding might be significantly different from a casual handshake. Bonding, Seven repeated. Shared energy exchange. A necessary process for stable energetic resonance. She held out her crystalline hand, not in a human gesture of offering, but more like an invitation to plug oneself into a very complex socket. Elias stared at the glowing, multifaceted hand and felt his heart pound in his chest. This was not just a scientific exploration anymore. This was something else. Something weird, possibly dangerous, and undeniably intriguing. He swallowed hard. Okay, he said, trying to sound as calm as possible, let's explore this. Logically, of course. Their daily encounters became a strange mix of scientific observations and awkward attempts at cross-cultural interaction. Elias would show her pictures of Earth, describing the oceans and mountains, while Seven would demonstrate her ability to manipulate the plants in the garden, making them bloom in impossible patterns. The KRYLL communication was still somewhat strange. He couldn't tell if her internal communications were intentional or an accident, but sometimes, as they interacted, the KRYLL's thoughts would leak into his own, often resulting in him being completely baffled by her logical thought processes. Their unusual dynamic wasn't lost on others. Elias noticed a few curious glances from other researchers on the station, and he knew the rumors had started. One day, while he was restocking his lab supplies, he overheard two of the station's junior botanists whispering about him. "Did you hear about Thorne?" one of them said, giggling. "He's spending all his time with the KRYLL. I heard he's trying to bond with it." "Seriously," the other one replied. That's really weird. Maybe he finally went mad. From the spores? You know, like that guy from Sector Theta?" Elias felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He wasn't mad, was he? Just fascinated? Obsessed? He shook his head and grabbed his supplies, trying to ignore their stares. It was then that he saw Dr. Aries Thorne, the other botanist, watching him from across the corridor. Thorne had a strange, calculating look on his face that made Elias feel instantly uncomfortable. Dr. Thorne had always been a bit of an enigma, a highly respected, but rather abrasive researcher who had a reputation for pushing ethical boundaries for the sake of scientific advancement. He had a habit of looking at every plant and creature as an object of study, with little regard for their individual well-being. Elias, on the other hand, had always approached his work with a sense of wonder and respect, seeing the beauty and complexity in every form of life. He was a bit of a nerd, but a caring one. Later that same day, Elias was in the botanical garden, showing Seven how to make a basic origami flower, carefully folding the edges of a leaf into a small, delicate shape. She stared at him with an expression that Elias found increasingly hard to interpret, but he was certain she was analyzing the process logically. Suddenly, Seven's internal light patterns went haywire, flickering with an almost violent intensity. Her body emitted a strange, buzzing sound, and before Elias could react, she released a potent burst of pheromones. The scent was overwhelming, a sweet, floral fragrance with a strange, almost intoxicating quality. Elias felt his knees buckle, his vision blurring. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and he grabbed onto a nearby vine to steady himself. His face was hot and his head spun, as if he had just drunk an entire bottle of wine. He was also acutely aware of Seven, not as a crystalline being, but as something more. A form of sentient flower that he was inexplicably drawn to. "Seven," he exclaimed, his voice sounding thick and slurred. What was that?" "Pheromonal output," she responded, her voice slightly distorted. "Attempting to initiate bonding sequence. Analysis, inconclusive. Human physiological response, unexpected." Elias blinked, his head swimming. "Bonding, sequence," he managed to stammer. "You mean, that was the KRYLL version of a romantic gesture?" Seven remained silent for a moment, her crystalline tendrils slightly drooping. Then, she stated, "Affirmative. My assessment indicated the high probability of successful mating sequence. It would be logical." Elias groaned inwardly, his face flushing a deep red. He managed to stumble away from her, feeling utterly overwhelmed. He loved a good scientific challenge, but interspecies dating? That was a completely different level of complicated. He knew that his heart had definitely skipped a beat when she emitted the pheromones, and he suddenly realized that his fascination with Seven was evolving into something entirely different. As he was trying to regain his senses, he realized that he was not just a curious botanist anymore. He was in the middle of a very messy, very complicated, and potentially very awkward interspecies love story, and that he was absolutely out of his depth. And yet, strangely, he couldn't help but feel a tiny bit excited. Elias spent the next few days trying to process the bonding attempt. He had retreated to his lab, surrounded by his notes and research equipment, desperately trying to regain his scientific composure. He reread every single article he could find on KRYLL biology, poring over the details of their reproductive cycles and their unique methods of communication, hoping to find some logical explanation for the pheromone-induced haze he'd experienced. He wasn't just a scientist anymore, he was a scientist in the middle of an interspecies romantic comedy, and he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. He also couldn't deny that he was drawn to her. He tried to rationalize it as a simple matter of curiosity, a deep scientific interest in understanding her unique biology, but his heart did not agree. Every time he thought of the way her crystalline tendrils had brushed his skin or the way her voice resonated in his mind, he felt a strange, tingling sensation in his chest. And that, he knew, was not just science. That was something else. Meanwhile, the energy surges on the station were becoming more frequent and more intense. The lights would flicker sporadically, and the station systems would briefly falter, creating a palpable sense of unease among the personnel. Elias, in his quest to understand what was causing Seven's erratic glitches, began to pay more attention to these events. He noticed that the surges seemed to be happening mostly in Sector Beta, where Dr. Aries Thorne had his research lab. He decided to do a little investigating on his own. He adjusted the lenses of his spectacles, grabbed his datapad, and headed towards Sector Beta, trying to appear as casual and inconspicuous as possible. He was dressed in his usual attire, a slightly too small t-shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of old sneakers that he had owned since his first year of college. The only thing he had added was a small, portable spectrometer that he used for various kinds of readings. The corridors in Sector Beta were more sterile and utilitarian than the lush, overgrown parts of the botanical garden. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and electronic equipment, and the general mood was one of tense, scientific focus. Elias walked past the laboratories, glancing through the large glass windows. He saw a group of researchers wearing sterile suits, huddled around complicated-looking machines, their faces illuminated by the flickering screens. As he got closer to Dr. Thorne's lab, he noticed an unusual amount of activity. The lab's door was slightly ajar, and Elias could hear the hum of powerful machinery and a faint, high-pitched whine that was similar to the sound he had heard when Seven had experienced her glitch. He felt a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He peeked through the narrow opening in the door, trying to observe without being seen. The lab was filled with complex equipment and strange, glowing containers. In the center of the room, he saw Thorne, hunched over a console, his face illuminated by the light of the screen. He was wearing a data glove on one hand, and he seemed to be manipulating various energy readings on the console, and Elias could see that on the side, there was a small container, filled with what looked like the crystalline tendrils of a KRYLL, glowing with the same erratic light pattern as Seven. Elias felt his blood run cold. Elias quickly pulled out his spectrometer and took some readings through the opening, trying to assess the unusual energy signature that seemed to be emanating from the lab. The readings were off the charts. The energy fluctuations were not only incredibly powerful but also strangely focused, almost like a controlled beam. Just as he was about to take another reading, Thorne suddenly turned around, his eyes narrowed. Elias quickly backed away from the door, trying to blend into the shadows. He knew he had been seen, and that Dr. Thorne would not take kindly to being spied on. He had to find a way to expose Thorn without being caught. He knew he wasn't a hero. He was just a slightly clumsy botanist with a deep love for all forms of life, even the ones with crystalline tendrils and a tendency to give electric shocks. The next day, Elias went to see Seven, hoping to share his findings. He found her in the botanical garden, sitting in a clearing surrounded by a cluster of luminous flowers. She seemed more subdued than usual, her light patterns dim and erratic. He approached her slowly, trying to gauge her emotional state, even though he knew that emotional states were more complex than a simple light pattern. "Seven," he said, his voice low. "Are you all right? You don't seem yourself." Seven turned towards him, her light patterns flickering erratically. "My systems are experiencing increased instability," she responded, her voice echoing in his mind with a touch of fatigue. "Energy fluctuations are interfering with network connectivity." "I know," Elias said, showing her the readings he had taken near Thorn's lab. "I think I know what's causing it. It's coming from Sector Beta, from Thorn's lab. He's using some kind of technology that's disrupting your connection to your network." Seven tilted her head, analyzing the readings. "The energy signature is similar to the resonance field necessary for crystalline equilibrium. However, the field is corrupted." "Corrupted? How?" Elias asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "The energy is distorted. Not optimized for our network's needs. It is being used to manipulate the crystalline structures. For research purposes." Her tendrils vibrated slightly. "It is a violation. A disruption of a logical process." Elias felt a surge of anger. He knew Thorn was unscrupulous, but he hadn't realized that he would go so far as to exploit a sentient species for his own gain. He was a scientist, for God's sake. Where was his ethics? He felt a protective instinct rising up inside him. "We have to stop him, Seven," Elias said, his voice resolute. "He can't just do this. He's hurting you." Seven remained still for a moment, her light patterns dimming. Then, she looked up at him, her crystalline face reflecting the soft light of the botanical garden. "Your emotional response is illogical. But your concern is acknowledged. I require assistance to stabilize my system." She moved closer to him. Close proximity, beneficial for energy resonance. She looked at him with a strange light in her crystalline face. "Whatever." It was an intense look. Elias felt a blush creep up his neck. "Close proximity, huh?" "Right. Well, I mean, yes. For science. We need to find a way to, stabilize your system." He tried to sound as scientific as possible, but his mind kept wandering back to the pheromone-induced haze and his own strange feelings. He spent the rest of the day working with Seven, trying to figure out how they could counteract the effects of Thorn's meddling. They analyzed the energy readings and discussed different possibilities, but they needed more information to come up with a plan. Later that evening, as Elias was heading back to his quarters, he was intercepted by Dr. Thorn. Thorn said, his voice sharp, "I believe you've been observing my research. Am I correct?" He approached Elias, his eyes cold and calculating. Elias tried to appear calm, despite the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. "I'm just doing my own research, Dr. Thorn. I have an interest in the station's energy fluctuations." He hoped that he sounded more confident than he felt. Thorn smirked. "Of course you do. You've always been a bit eccentric, haven't you? A little too sentimental for your own good. You are not cut out for real science. And what is this interest in the KRYLL I've been hearing about?" Elias gritted his teeth, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm interested in the ethical treatment of all living beings, Dr. Thorn. Something you seem to lack." Thorn laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Ethics? In science? That's just a romantic fantasy. What truly matters are results. And I am on the verge of a breakthrough that will redefine everything we know about interspecies energy transfer." I'm sure you can comprehend the scope of my work. This is no simple plant experiment. He moved even closer. And perhaps you could stay out of my way? I won't tolerate any interference. Elias stood his ground, refusing to back down. I won't let you hurt her, Thorn, he said, his voice low and resolute. He didn't even notice that he'd referred to Seven with a her pronoun. I'm going to expose you for what you are. Thorn's expression hardened. You're a fool, Thorn. You have no idea what you're up against. You and your little alien friend. I wouldn't be surprised if they've already started to manipulate you through their pheromones. Don't be naive, Thorn, some species are just designed to dominate. He left Elias standing in the corridor, his words hanging in the air. Elias felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Thorn was a dangerous man and that he was willing to go to any lengths to achieve his goals. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. He had to protect Seven, and he had to expose Thorn. He just hoped that his logical deductions, combined with a little human ingenuity, would be enough to win this increasingly complex interspecies battle. He also realized that he was starting to truly care about the glitchy, pheromone-emitting crystalline alien that he was now apparently trying to save from a corrupt scientist. And that realization was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The confrontation with Dr. Thorn left Elias feeling a mixture of anger and apprehension. He knew that Thorn wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to protect his research, and that Elias needed to act quickly if he wanted to save Seven. He returned to the botanical garden, where he found Seven in a state of distress. Her crystalline body was flickering erratically, and her light patterns were becoming increasingly unstable. She was emitting a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Seven, Elias said, approaching her cautiously. Are you all right? My systems are critical, Seven responded, her voice barely audible. Network connection failing. Crystalline equilibrium compromised. Elias felt a pang of worry in his chest. He had never seen her so vulnerable. He knew that if he didn't do something soon, the disruption caused by Thorn would completely overwhelm her. We need to find a way to counteract that energy signature Thorn is using, Seven. I think if we can mimic the correct frequency, we might be able to stabilize your systems. It will be like a charging station. Or a very specific tuning fork. Seven tilted her head slightly, analyzing his words. A frequency harmonization is a logical solution. However, the correct energy signature is complex. I have to recalibrate my sensors. She tried to activate the crystalline tendrils on her arms, but they only twitched weakly, emitting faint sparks of energy. Elias knew that he couldn't rely on Thorn's ethically questionable research and resources. He had to do things his own way, with his limited supplies and the knowledge he had accumulated over years of studying plant life and its many complex ecosystems. He returned to his lab, his mind racing. He pulled out his notes and research equipment, frantically searching for any piece of information that could help him create a device to mimic the correct energy signature. He was trying to think like a scientist, but he was also acting like a man trying to save the girl of his dreams. He spent hours hunched over his workbench, combining various components and experimenting with different energy frequencies. He was trying to recreate the ideal electromagnetic resonance needed for the KRYLL, something that would restore the stability of their crystalline structures. He was working against the clock, the energy surges on the station growing more frequent and intense. He could feel the tension in the air, the humming of the machinery in the station growing louder. He knew that Thorn was probably not sitting idly and that he had to be faster. He was also getting increasingly desperate. He finally came up with a design for a portable device that could generate a specific frequency of electromagnetic resonance, something he called a crystal harmonizer. It was a crude, makeshift creation, cobbled together from repurposed research equipment and spare parts, but Elias was hoping that it would be enough to get the job done. He rushed back to the botanical garden, clutching the device to his chest. "Seven, I think I have something that might help," he said, approaching her with a hopeful expression. He held up the crystal harmonizer. "It's not pretty, but I think it might work." "I'm not sure, of course." but it's worth a try. I hope. Seven looked at the device, her internal lights flickering. Your efforts are appreciated, Elias. I will analyze the energy signature and give you feedback. She managed to activate one of her crystalline tendrils and gently touched the crystal harmonizer, her body briefly lighting up as it absorbed the energy. Elias watched with bated breath as Seven's body reacted to the device. For a moment, the erratic flickering seemed to slow down, and her light patterns became slightly more stable. But then, suddenly, she winced, her crystalline tendrils contracting, as another surge of energy erupted from her body. The device is partially effective, she said, her voice weak. But it is not enough to restore full equilibrium. The energy signature is too weak and slightly off. Elias felt his heart sink. He had hoped that his makeshift device would be the solution. Okay, I understand. Then I need to amplify the signal. And adjust the frequency. It's not optimal yet. I just need a bigger power source and more sensitive receptors. He started to analyze the data, furiously jotting down notes on his datapad, when Seven's voice echoed in his head, her thoughts clearer and more focused than they had been for days. The station's central power grid contains a strong energy source, she said. If we can tap into it, we might be able to generate the necessary resonance. Elias looked up in surprise. The central power grid? That's risky, Seven. I don't know if we can do that, and we will attract attention of the station security. And Thorn will notice. But it might be our only chance. Seven nodded. It is necessary. The risk assessment is acceptable when compared to the imminent damage to my system. It's logical. Elias knew that he was running out of time and that he had to take a risk if he wanted to save Seven. He started planning their next move. They decided that they would try to reroute the energy from the central grid through the crystal harmonizer to amplify its signal and stabilize Seven. As they were preparing to leave the botanical garden, they were interrupted by Dr. Aries Thorn, accompanied by 2 armed guards. Thorn had a triumphant smirk on his face. Well, Thorn, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. It seems you've been quite busy. I've noticed you spending a lot of time in this garden, tinkering with your toys. And what is this, the charging station? Trying to become an electrical engineer as well? Elias stood in front of Seven protectively, holding the crystal harmonizer firmly in his hands. I'm just trying to help a sentient being. Something you clearly don't understand. Thorn laughed, a cold, mocking sound. Sentient? Please, Thorn. It's a machine, an anomaly. An object for scientific study. And you? You're an obstacle. I'm sure you are aware that hindering my research is going to have some consequences. Your research is harming her, Elias stated, his voice strong. And I'm going to stop you. He activated the crystal harmonizer, and a faint hum filled the air. The station's lighting flickered slightly, and Elias could feel a surge of energy coursing through the device. Thorn's eyes widened with surprise. What is that? Where did you get that? He motioned to the guards to move forward. Get him. Stop him now. Elias knew that he was outmatched, but he wasn't going to back down. He knew he had to buy Seven some time. Run, Seven, he yelled, activating the crystal harmonizer fully, directing its energy towards her. I'll hold them off. Seven moved with surprising speed, her crystalline tendrils extended to their full length, and she was suddenly moving like a complex machine rather than a peaceful plant. She used her abilities to manipulate the plants around them, creating a temporary barrier of vines and flowers. She then focused her energy, and her body suddenly glowed with an intense, blinding light, sending the guard stumbling backwards. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of crackling energy and the rustling of frantic foliage, a symphony of chaos and unexpected beauty. Elias saw an opportunity, and he took it. He grabbed a handful of bioluminescent spores from a nearby fungus patch and threw them into the air, creating a cloud of glowing particles that temporarily blinded the guards and Dr. Thorn, while Seven used her abilities to pull away a portion of a large tree, creating an escape passage. He and Seven managed to escape, leaving Thorn and the guards bewildered in the chaos of the botanical garden. They knew that Thorn would be coming after them, and that they had to move quickly if they wanted to succeed in their mission and save Seven. They had started an interspecies battle that had completely surpassed the scope of both their lives, and they were finally on the run. But they were also, somehow, a team now. A clumsy human botanist with a heart of gold and a glitchy, pheromone-emitting crystalline alien with a penchant for logic and a surprising ability to move with the grace of a sentient machine. And they were about to take on the entire station to save her life, and to challenge the unethical and unscrupulous nature of scientific progress. Elias and Seven found themselves in a precarious situation. They were on the run, hunted by Dr. Thorn and the station's security forces, but they were also on a mission to save Seven's life. They had managed to escape the botanical gardens, but they knew that Thorn would be hot on their heels, especially after the rather chaotic scene they had left behind. They made their way through the station's maintenance tunnels, a maze of pipes and wires that Elias, with his engineer's mind, had memorized during his exploration of the station. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, a stark contrast to the lush, fragrant atmosphere of the botanical garden. Seven, despite her weakened state, moved with surprising speed and agility, her crystalline body shimmering in the dim light. The central power grid is located in Sector Alpha E9, Seven stated, her voice echoing faintly in Elias's mind. We must reach it quickly. My internal systems are critical. Elias nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the urgency in Seven's words, and he knew that every second counted. He checked the map on his datapad and led the way through the labyrinthine corridors, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He felt like he was playing a very dangerous and highly illogical game of tag, and he knew that the stakes were extremely high. They finally reached the entrance to the power grid, a large, reinforced door with a complicated locking mechanism. Elias pulled out his engineering toolkit, his hands trembling slightly, and began to work on the lock. He knew that they had to get in quickly and without raising any alarms. He was not used to acting like a criminal, but this was not the time to be a good boy, even if he had to break some rules to save Seven. He was also incredibly aware that this time, he was fighting not just to preserve life, but to save someone that he had grown to love. As he worked, Seven stood beside him, her body emitting a low, rhythmic hum. She focused her energy, manipulating the wires and cables surrounding the door to create a small distraction, hoping to cause the central security system to reset, even if just for a few seconds. Finally, with a loud click, the door swung open. They slipped inside, entering a vast chamber filled with humming machinery and sparking wires. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and electricity, and the sheer power of the energy grid was palpable. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline as he looked around at the complex, almost overwhelming infrastructure. The central transformer is located on the lower level, Seven stated, her voice slightly stronger now. We must connect the crystal harmonizer to it and amplify its energy signature. Elias nodded, and they started to make their way to the lower level, navigating through the maze of cables and equipment. They were surrounded by enough energy to power a small planet, and he was about to attempt to tap into it to save his friend, and maybe something more. He could also feel the irony of his situation. He had always been a peaceful botanist, and now, he was about to become an accidental terrorist with a penchant for plant-based life forms. They reached the central transformer, a massive, humming device that seemed to pulsate with power. Elias carefully connected the crystal harmonizer to the transformer, and then he adjusted the settings on his datapad, trying to fine-tune the energy signature to match Seven's unique needs. He glanced at Seven, her crystalline body shimmering faintly, her light patterns becoming slightly more stable. Initiating energy transfer, he said, his voice filled with anticipation. He hit the activation button, and the crystal harmonizer glowed with an intense light. A powerful surge of energy flowed through the device, into Seven's body. For a moment, everything was quiet, then, a wave of pure energy washed over them, causing the entire chamber to hum. Seven stood still, her body absorbing the energy, her crystalline tendrils expanding and contracting, like a flower finally blooming in full sunlight. Her light patterns became vibrant and strong, and the erratic flickering finally ceased. Elias felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. Just as he was starting to feel like they had succeeded, the lights in the chamber suddenly flickered, and the alarm started to blare. The door burst open, and Dr. Thorne stormed into the chamber, accompanied by a squad of security guards. His face was contorted with rage. "You fools!" Thorne yelled. "You think you can stop me? You think you can just waltz into my lab and disrupt everything? I will not let you destroy my research, my life's work." Elias stood his ground, holding his datapad in front of him like a shield. "Your research is unethical, Thorne. You're hurting innocent sentient beings. And we won't let you do it anymore." Thorne laughed maniacally. "Innocent? They are experiments, not people. And you, Thorne, you're just a misguided botanist who has let his feelings cloud his judgment. That thing has somehow managed to seduce you, just as she seduces anything with a pulse." Seven stepped forward, her crystalline body glowing with a powerful light. "Your assessment is incorrect," she stated, her voice echoing throughout the chamber. "Elias's actions are based on a logical assessment of my state. And what you are doing is illogical and dangerous." She paused for a moment, and looked at Elias with an expression that he couldn't quite define, something akin to fondness. It was very strange and very intense. "We will not let you continue, Dr. Thorne," Seven continued. She extended her crystalline tendrils, and a powerful surge of energy emanated from her body, causing the equipment in the chamber to spark and sputter. She was now working like a complex machine with a very clear and defined purpose. Thorne's guards tried to restrain her, but she moved with incredible speed, manipulating the plants around them to create a temporary barrier. She then created a localized electromagnetic field, disrupting the guards' weapons, rendering them useless. Chaos erupted, with sparks flying, alarms blaring, and the smell of ozone filling the air. In the midst of the chaos, Thorne tried to escape, but Elias moved quickly, blocking his path. They struggled, wrestling for the control of the datapad, when Thorne tripped and stumbled, losing his balance. He fell to the ground, scattering several small vials he had been holding in his pocket, tiny glass containers filled with the same crystalline structures that were integrated into Seven's body. The vials shattered on the floor, sending the crystalline fragments flying in all directions, impacting the nearby plant life and triggering a strange reaction. The plants around them began to glow with an intense, unnatural light, and vines started to grow rapidly, twisting and turning around them. It was a wild, chaotic mess, and Thorne and his guards were completely overwhelmed by the sheer power of a sentient plant-based ecosystem. Elias managed to grab Thorne's data pad, securing the evidence that could expose Thorne's unethical activities. He looked around at the scene, and shook his head. "Well," he muttered, "that escalated quickly." Finally, station security arrived, and Thorne and his guards were arrested. The station's engineers and technicians began the process of restoring order, and Elias and Seven retreated back to the botanical garden, exhausted but victorious. They had finally won, and they had done it together. The botanical garden was quiet and peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of the bioluminescent fungi. Seven sat in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by a cluster of glowing flowers. Elias sat beside her, watching the gentle sway of the vines and the soft, shifting patterns of light. He could feel a deep sense of peace, a calm that he hadn't felt in days. "Thank you, Elias," Seven said, her voice clear and strong. "You have saved my life and restored equilibrium to my system." She turned her crystalline face towards him, and Elias felt a familiar tingle in his chest. He was definitely in love with a strange alien. It's an honor, Seven," Elias said, his voice slightly hoarse. "And maybe this means our proximity is not only logical, but, well, maybe enjoyable. I hope you don't mind me saying." Seven was silent for a moment, analyzing his words. "Your assessment is accurate," she finally said. "The shared energy exchange has been beneficial. My assessment indicated that a prolonged exposure with your energy signature would be conducive to my systems." She moved closer to him, and her crystalline tendrils gently brushed his skin. Elias felt a surge of warmth, a feeling that went way beyond science and logic. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with her delicate, crystalline tendrils. Their bodies were different, their cultures were worlds apart, but in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the connection they had formed, a bond that had transcended the boundaries of science, logic, and even the very definition of love. They spent the next few weeks together, exploring the station, sharing their unique perspectives, and learning more about each other. Elias taught her about the beauty of human emotions, while Seven helped him understand the complex nature of crystalline structures and the importance of logical thinking. Their relationship continued to evolve, becoming a complex mix of science, emotion, and utterly bizarre situations. And as he sat there in the botanical garden with his glitchy, pheromone-emitting crystalline alien, Elias knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, living a life that was more strange, more wonderful, and infinitely more interesting than he had ever imagined. He had finally found his place, a small, slightly chaotic corner of the galaxy where love and logic could coexist and where even the most unexpected of bonds could bloom. And that, he knew, was a scientific breakthrough, in more ways than one. He smiled, finally relaxing, and feeling more himself than ever before.